Thank you so much for everybody attending here, our talk today. We're going to have an introduction of Meaghan here in a moment, but certainly appreciate everybody's participation. I'm very pleased to turn this over to Jason Hart, who is a classmate of Meaghan's, which is how we even got to Meaghan. So a debt of gratitude to Jason. He's also an advisory board member of the Steer Center. So Jason, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much, my friend.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And thanks for having me here. It is my pleasure to introduce Meaghan Muldoon, who is currently Managing Director of BlackRock, where she's been since 2016. At BlackRock, Meaghan's the global head of ESG integration, which means she's been much more successful than I have. So congratulations, Meaghan. As Matt mentioned, Meaghan is a classmate of myself, class of '99 at Georgetown. After Georgetown, she went on to Duke University, where she got her master's in public policy, and then did this little thing working for a little thing called the White House in the Obama administration for 7 years, where again, she did much more important things than probably most of us who are on this call. Meaghan was always, as you can see, always has a smile on her face. So I'm glad to see that hasn't changed over the last couple of decades, and was always one of the absolute nicest people in the class of '99. And I think Meaghan is a testament that nice people can actually and do finish first. So I will, before handing it off to Matt, we also have Matt Seifer on the line, who Matt is a Kaufman Professor and Director of the Steer Center for Real Estate at Georgetown. Previously, from having that role, Matt was at Invesco, where he led their underwriting group and their valuations group. But most importantly, Matt has almost single-handedly put the Steer Center for Real Estate on the map, taking it from a idea that a few people had, and now making it one of the leading centers for real estate in education. And we are always extremely thankful for all of his hard work. So Matt's going to lead this. We're going to try to keep this as informal and conversational as possible. So with that, I will shut up and hand it over to Matt.
Good job, man. Except mine was a little long and a little some lies in there too. But thank you very much. The thing I'm excited about is, although I didn't go to Georgetown, we are all, myself included, class of '99, and I've been told that there might be some class of '99 folks from Georgetown also on this. So welcome. I'm not sure how I feel. I was thinking this morning, do I feel old? Maybe I do feel old. I don't know. But that was a great year. We were talking about our collective spring break experiences in the green room to determine if we were anywhere at the same point in time. So welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Our style on these things, we want to keep them as enjoyable and as lively as we can and have some fun. So my style on these when we get started really is I'm always interested in learning more about who we're talking to. I mean, frankly, if you were to take one of my classes, I spend the first 10 minutes just chatting people up because I never really liked the faculty members who jumped right into the content. Like, it's no fun. Like the fun is the chatting. So Meaghan, I hope we could maybe spend a couple minutes and just, get to know you beyond the introduction, that Jason gave. But, where are you from? How'd you get to Georgetown? How'd you wind up working for President Obama? Like all that sort of stuff. What's the fun stuff?
Thanks so much. I'm super excited to be here, and I can tell this is going to be one of the more fun fireside chats that I've done in the past. So thanks, Jason, and thanks, Matt, for the opportunity to speak with everybody. About me, I grew up in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I came to Georgetown as a transfer. So I actually was one of those people that made kind of an error in judgment first, and then landed up exactly where I was supposed to be, living in Darnell with all the other transfers through my sophomore year. From Georgetown, I worked at a corp. I was a corpie. So that was like a big part of my Georgetown experience. And as I worked at the corp, I realized there was something in the world called public policy, which sounded like exactly what I wanted to do, because it was the chance to go between government and public sector and private sector and try to do this all in a way that was kind of to the public good. So that was the path that I took. I went to Duke, did public policy for grad school, did a little foray into federal government from there. I spent actually 13 years in federal government, kind of finishing up at the White House and the Treasury Department under President Obama, which was kind of the result of kind of happy accidents. We can talk about that later on. And government finishing up a kind of happy action up until almost the end. I was in a policy making job, and at the end you stopped doing policy and you start doing legacy. And I thought that was a good time to leave before I officially got fired at the end of the 8 years. And I had a chance to go up to work at BlackRock. And so BlackRock was really cool and interesting to me because in federal government, I was looking at things like how do we increase our investment in public infrastructure? How do we finance higher education? How do we ensure financial security? BlackRock thinks about all those things too, just from a different point of view. And so I wanted to see, number one, what does another actor in the system do? But then also, number two, after having spent so much time in public sector, could I be successful in another sector? And could I find my transferable skills and bring them along with me? So that was how I ended up in BlackRock, doing strategy, ultimately doing sustainable investment.
And you were, I think, in New York for a period of time, but then you just relatively recently moved to London, which is where you're at right now. Is that fair?
I am in London now, so this is my end of the day. I'm sure I'm one of the only ones on the call in that happy position on a Friday afternoon.
Well, we can all be there.
Yeah, I was going to say I was a year and a half in New York, and then for personal reasons wanted to move to London, but that worked really well because in sustainable investing, particularly 3 years ago when I came over, the center of our business is in New York, but the center of the assets in motion and the clients that were really concerned and actually activating sustainability in their portfolios was all in Europe. So I came over to kind of lead the piece of the business over here and try to establish BlackRock in that space.
Well, obviously BlackRock is a leader here. I mean, we were talking a bit in the green room. There's a Wall Street Journal article that came out recently, and we're in the middle of proxy season, so we're not going to talk about a lot of that stuff, for good reason. But you talk about a group right in the middle of all this stuff as it relates to ESG, and so again, thrilled to have you here. But can you talk as a global head of ESG integration at BlackRock? What does that mean? And I've sort of been stuck on this word integration. What does that mean?
That is a super important question, and these are words that don't mean a lot to a lot of people. So it's good to kind of define our terms. So ESG integration at BlackRock is how we think about bringing material ESG considerations into all of our portfolios. So not just how we build products with a sustainability objective, but how we try to move the whole of our kind of assets under management to make sure that we're incorporating the ESG risks and opportunities in our standard investment processes. We have about $400 billion of sustainable products at BlackRock, but we have $9 trillion of assets that we manage. And so if we think that ESG risk and climate risk are investment risk, then we should be thinking about that not just in the products with a sustainable objective, but in how we manage everything for all of our clients.
So I love that. So we were talking also earlier, I'm on the board of a small public REIT by the name of Global Medical REIT, and we are grappling with this issue, and hopefully a lot of my fellow board members are on, but we're $1 billion firm trying to figure out our strategy. You're a $1 trillion something firm. I mean, how do you think about integrating this stuff across so many lines of business, so many people? Is there a framework that you start with? I mean, what's the organizing approach here, just from just sort of structurally?
Yeah. So for context, BlackRock we're massive. We're the largest asset manager globally, and we manage everything from cash to real assets. We have active investment, we have index investment, we have equity, we have fixed income. We're really across the board. And so my mandate is to work with all of the active investment platforms to help them identify where ESG considerations can be material, and also how you can include consideration of ESG information in their existing investment processes. That's going to be very different across all those parts of the platform. So we really have centered on something that we call a principles-based approach to ESG integration. So we have a North Star. The North Star is, we think that sustainability risk and climate risk are investment risk. And there's two reasons why we think that. One is, E and S and G considerations have not yet fully been priced into assets in the market. And so there is kind of embedded risk and opportunity that can be discovered, and that there's kind of ways to differentiate performance according to those kinds of information. And then the second is, we think that we're on the front end of a really significant reallocation of capital, with capital flowing towards assets and assets with better sustainability characteristics and away from assets with poorer sustainability characteristics. And then that over time is actually going to have a pricing of risk and assets in the market, wholesale. And so we need to be thinking about these things. How that's done across different parts of the platform can vary. And that's not only okay, that's appropriate, that's what we want to see. What we ask our investors to do is kind of tackle this from two different points of view. One, there's a set of considerations we think are important for all portfolio managers to have a grip on. And that's how we think about something we call our heightened scrutiny framework. There's a set of characteristics that we think are important enough that everybody should be looking at them. And so our risk and quantitative analysis team that meets with all of our investors helps us implement that heightened scrutiny framework. So they're bringing those considerations into their regular risk considerations. The second is working with investment managers to understand like what's material for the kind of investment that I do. So as a REIT, where are the places where there's actually considerations that can like drive value or present risk that might not be the frame of how I evaluate investments. And let's find ways to bring that information in.
So let's talk about you said about sort of moving away from investments that have sustainability risk. You said it better as in to investments that are more sustainable. And again, we think about real estate. Of course, we're all, or for the most part, here in real estate, and a lot of the investing occurs on the coast in the United States. I mean, there's really nothing but climate risk and sustainability issues. So how do you think about the what you just sort of outlined and actually implementing some of that from an execution perspective? And my suspicion is there's a lot of sort of, I don't know what the word would be, but varying degrees of buy-in, perhaps, or maybe not. I don't know. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, specifically from a real estate perspective, this is one of the things where it's been really interesting for me to learn more. We have a large real estate team. We have a broader real assets team, but within that we have a specific real estate team that spends a lot of time on this. And we have sustainability experts that are embedded in that team itself. And I know BlackRock is big, and we have the luxury of having that that kind of resource. But the challenge you would think of in real estate and in more broadly in real assets is this lack of data, the data challenge. What is it that we want to measure? How can we measure it? But on the other side of it, I think there's actually like a really natural impulse to be thinking about these kinds of issues, because it is not crazy to be thinking about the risk of flooding when you're thinking about a real estate asset. There's some of this that is very natural and has actually been part of the process for a long time. But when we think about ESG integration in real estate specifically, particularly on the on the E side, I'll start there. There's three different things that we're thinking about. One, as I said, climate risk is investment risk. That is very, very clearly true when you're thinking about a physical asset like real estate. So there are ways that you can build resilience into the architecture of the assets that you're building. That's something that we've definitely had success in, and there's case studies that I could talk about. I think another way to think about that is, the risk assessment that you do on the front end. We've gotten pretty creative in how we think about this. We're actually working with a group called Rhodium that does kind of geospatial mapping of storm systems to create risk models to identify which areas are more likely to be hit by hurricanes over time. And we think about that as part of the assessment for the various real estate asset deals that we're working with. So there's the risk piece of this. There's also an opportunity piece of this. So as I said, this is goes back to the reallocation of capital. People are really interested in kind of the upside that can come from sustainable real estate. We've actually done really interesting financial transactions also, where we've used, for example, financing packages that had covenants related to green considerations built into them. We did this with student housing in the UK. I think that there's a lot of ways between either financing, but also kind of the value proposition you're bringing to potential tenants through sustainability as well. And then of course there's the ways in which we're engaging with the industry to really try to drive progress and set standards. So GRESB is an important standard in real estate, where we partner with GRESB. We also partner with the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investing, to help to define what standards look like. there's a whole lot of considerations. I know that Matt, you've been talking with me on the side a little bit about how you're thinking about S considerations as well. I think S is really interesting right now in real estate, especially as we come out of COVID. And there's more that we can talk about there as well.
Well, maybe we can migrate our way there, but the experience that I've sort of seen is the E it gets a lot of oxygen because you can actually start to measure stuff, right? I think part of the problem here is that there's a lot of granularity and you can actually, again, measure it, and a lot with the G too, frankly, and some of the governance issues. That's sort of fairly standard. And the S, as we talked about, is kind of in the middle, but and maybe we are just going to go there. I mean, what are you thinking about as it relates to the S? And maybe a more defined question. What sort of a framework do you build to try to create sustainable or meaningful change at the S and in the S? And anyway.
Yeah, I think with the S, 2020 was like a massive year for S because of COVID. And if you think about what we're doing with real estate, we're placemaking. And so the question is, what are the considerations that we need to bring to placemaking in light of what we've learned from COVID? I think I'm kind of excited by this because I think there's a lot of dimensions. But one is, we want to create community spaces. And I think that feeling of belonging and engagement and kind of the ways that you can build a community through the asset that you're building, that is in itself like a very natural S consideration. But if you think about post-COVID, how does, there's a lot more focus on obvious things like what is the air filtration system, what are the health and safety considerations of the buildings that are being lived in, but also thinking about what are the kind of the repurposing of the ways that people live, and how can we make our real estate investments kind of appropriate for that. So right now you have more people that are working from home. Can you build that? Can you embed that into the consideration flexibility that is going to be coming from a post-COVID world? Similarly, if you're looking at a non-residential, but like an office space, how do you account for the kinds of risks that we've just learned about through something like COVID in how you design and build that space? The interaction between the two, what is the commute between point A and point B? And in a post-COVID world, what are the ways in which people are going to be commuting? So I think that those kinds of those are the S considerations that have really come into sight post-COVID. But I think, beyond that, there really is, I think, this the kind of the community building, the stakeholders, understanding what you're doing to the not just the asset itself, but the environment, the community around it. When we think about S across the board and in ESG integration, we're not thinking about S social, we're thinking about S stakeholder considerations. And so our stakeholders are our shareholders, certainly, but also our employees, the communities that we're invested in, and what is the implication for the investments that we're making across that set of stakeholders. And I think that gives a kind of, it's a step towards a clearer frame for how to think about material S considerations.
Gotcha. And we talk a lot about, within the Steer Center of these objectives, they're important, but they got to create alpha, right? And so they got to improve performance. And so, as you integrate across the portfolio, how are you thinking about, measurement of performance and being able to really articulate what is moving the needle either positively or negatively?
Yeah, and again, this is something that how we do this across different asset classes is really different. I'm going to start with what I think is probably like the easiest place to see the delta, and then we can kind of evolve to real estate, which is somewhere I think it's a little bit more on the scale where it feels more like preferences at this point, but we can go from A to B. I think the most measurable place of this is if you think about, I'm thinking about public markets now, if you think about systematic investing. Where really you just have a huge number of issuers that are included in a portfolio, and there's kind of a scientific model that is being used to find alpha, to generate alpha relative to a benchmark. You use different investment signals, which is basically like research hypotheses, to try to improve the alpha in that model. We've found that our systematic investment team actually uses roughly 20% ESG signals in a traditional model, not an ESG model, but a traditional model in its alpha seeking activities. So it's really like, in that case, the bar is very high. There's a research insight. It's only used in the model if it generates more alpha, but 20% of the signals that are used in our core models today are ESG related insights. And they have to do with things like workplace culture, for example, or environmental considerations clearly is some of that as well. But that's a really measurable way to demonstrate the alpha, because if it doesn't make the bar, it just isn't included in the model. If you think about real estate, I think there's something that is like very specific to real estate, which is these assets last a really long time. And so you need to have something today that is going to be durable for a multi-decade time horizon. And so how do you make sure that you're investing in something that, number one, there's investments you can make that have to do with a very short-term kind of return, some of the green energy considerations, energy auditing and improvements that can be made on that space. But also, what is the regulatory framework and also the standard of expectation going to be 30 years down the line? So I think I'll pause there.
Well,
I can keep going. You can push me farther if you want more. Or we can.
No, that's good. That's good. And I mean, one of the things that I think about as we think sort of in my own world and as it relates to real estate is trying to look in other maybe financial disciplines for ESG execution that's done really well, right? So the just other models outside of real estate is, does any vertical, if you will, do this really well, or should we be really looking in some other areas of BlackRock to see sort of frameworks and structures and things like that could be ported over to real estate?
I mean, I think that I would argue that real estate can do this really well. And so what's important is just finding a frame that's going to work for what you're looking at. What we think about when we're thinking about, let's look at the E pillar within real estate, we're thinking about a couple things. Number one, you have to understand the measurement of the assets that you have in place. We partner with a group called Measurable to make sure that we have a kind of a clear assessment of scope 1, scope 2, as well as water consumption, water waste metrics, these kinds of things for a lot of our assets. We do this actually right now for more than 60% of our real estate book. But going from there, what are we looking to manage? We're looking at energy auditing and energy use reduction. We're looking at the ability to, for example, generate on-site renewable power. That's something that I think is becoming a more important part of our portfolios. We're also looking at the ability to procure renewable energy as the input for the buildings that we manage. We also are really thinking about each stage of the investment process. So I think often we think about ESG considerations in the kind of the research, due diligence, deal sourcing phase. But you should also think about what you can build into the ongoing contracts. What are the covenants that are associated with management? And how can you make sure that this is something where sourcing the data that you want is something you consider on the front end to make sure that that is something you have access to over the life cycle of the asset itself. And so there's, I think, a lot of good innovation that is happening across the kind of the components, the phases of the kind of investment cycle.
Maybe to ask a very granular question, if this maybe gets beyond, redirect me, but some of the issues with the E relate to just operating expense sort of reimbursement structure, and that you can make all this sort of measurement and improvement, but the tenant's the sole beneficiary of savings and things of that nature. And obviously we could talk about occupancy costs, and you're sort of lowering the occupancy costs, which should make you more competitive in theory. But how do you think about those kinds of things that don't necessarily impact the performance of the building or the investment?
Well, I think the thing to think about is this is an asset that is it's a long time horizon asset, but it's also an asset that one day is going to be sold. And so think about the profile of the asset that you want to be able to sell in the future as well. And so the improvements that you're making now really change the value proposition for the asset at the point of sale. And so it's a longer term sense of that value, but it is, I think that's something that's also actually very measurable.
I mean, that's fair. Maybe you get a little better cap rate on your sale price. I think that makes some sense to me. I think something that we're looking at a lot is this notion of greenwashing in the real estate space, and things being certified, if you will, and suggested to be sustainable, but when you dig in, it's not really sustainable. So, we spend a lot of time talking about how, frankly, new construction is horribly non-sustainable. Concrete's terrible. There's a lot of just really bad stuff that goes into the construction phase, which is arguably the most sort of carbon intensive. So everything that happens in the operational phase happens over a 50-year time frame, which we kind of, I think, have lulled ourselves into believing we're doing the right thing. But when you really dig into it, there's a lot of work to do yet. Is BlackRock trying to peel or I don't know what the cliche would be, just to really authentically look at the sustainability piece of this thing?
Yeah, I think I actually, there was kind of like a data point that I called 2 people to check on before I got on this call today to make sure I had it right, because it didn't seem quite right to me, but it is. And I was looking at the sustainability standards in the real estate sector, and I was surprised to see that the current frameworks are really focused on energy use and consumption, not the upfront embedded energy or the upfront embedded carbon in the building itself. That is right now the state of the art. I think that is something that is going to change as our ability to measure other things improve. My understanding, and you are way more expert on this, Matt, than I am, so correct me, that if you're looking at first of all, real estate is almost 40% of carbon emissions, full stop, right, for globally. Of that, I think about 2/3 has to do with that energy consumption use over the life cycle of the building, and then about 1/4 is the kind of the upfront, the cement, the kind of the building of the building itself. So from that lens, it makes sense that right now the focus is on the energy components that we actually have the ability to manage. Like, we know what the levers are, we know how to measure, we know how to change the composition, what's coming in and what's going out. But that's not gonna, with as quickly as the market's moving right now, that's not gonna be it from here to eternity. That's something that's probably gonna change fairly quickly. And so I think, one of the real challenges when you think about net zero is like cement and building supply. How do you do that in a very different way? But there's going to be a lot of scientific thinking put to that to try to figure out what are the solutions. But I think the standards over time are going to start embedding that as well. And then there is this kind of like new versus upcycling, and I think that's probably going to become more of a premium as we go forward as well. Kind of the understanding that using the already embedded kind of resources versus tearing it down and building something new is something that I think is also going to become kind of embedded in some of these standards as we go forward. But that is very much evolving. I think it's like what gets measured gets managed, and if we can't measure it yet, it's still hard to manage.
So I love this conversation because we're dealing with a lot of net zero concepts ourselves, and again, you can be net zero operationally, but you still got to build the building. And so this adaptive reuse, I think you call it upcycling, I think makes a lot of sense. The question I have, and I don't want to put you on the spot, is when do the tenants that have an ability to absorb a little higher rent, frankly, such as a BlackRock, perhaps, say it's the right thing to do to go in these buildings that are being adaptively reused? They might have 8.5-foot ceilings versus 10. There's stuff that just isn't functionally ideal, but it is the right thing to do. So it is not functionally ideal. It might be locationally fine. It might be a little bit more expensive just simply because of all the work that had to go into the solar arrays and the tapping into the sewer systems and things like that. At what point do those tenants begin to acknowledge that responsibility and sort of execute that way from a leasing of their own space?
It's a fantastic question. I think that part of something that's going to help to drive that is thinking about the building standards, like green building standards. Everybody loves a LEED certified building. Everyone loves the highest rated building, but those frameworks need to start to take into account those kinds of considerations that we're talking about now as well. And I would be, again, I think that this is something, all of these frameworks are very dynamic and are going to continue to evolve. That's something that should become a lens in how we think about those now. I'm not expert enough to know how that is embedded in how we think about the standards today. But I think that is what's going to start to move the market, because a tenant like BlackRock wants to say we are in the highest certified, sustainable building. And if that doesn't include what we've just discussed, then that creates a kind of a tension. Right.
Well, I can't wait to see how that evolves, because that's really putting your money where your mouth is. And I'm not talking about you, of course, but the industry, because that's, I really feel strongly about that. But, about 5 minutes ago, we were talking about something related, kind of a framework concept. And you said, I think the quote was, you got to find a frame that really works for you. And I think in the context of just organizing sort of an ESG mindset. And part of the struggle I think we have is there are rating agencies all over the place of varying degrees of credibility and quality. They'll rate the most, minute sort of, one sheet of the paper, and you're sort of overwhelmed with detail. And so our struggle is, and I'm not suggesting it's necessarily ours or mine, but there's this, how do I develop a frame that works for us versus we're getting beat up all over the place by all these individual, entities that purport to be a leading expert in so-and-so as it relates to ESG. So you kind of got to just, kind of put on your sort of blinders a little bit and, to your point, find a frame that really works. Can you talk about that sort of tension between finding a frame that works, but also knowing that there's all this noise out here that's coming in, that's going to be very critical?
Yeah, and I'm gonna kind of take the speaker's prerogative and take 2 steps back and do this from like a more macro, not just real estate asset class perspective, because I spend more time in the kind of the broader public market space. One of the things that people love to say as a kind of an obstacle to getting serious about ESG integration is the data all says different things, and therefore, if the correlation between data set A and data set B is basically none, then how can I use any of this information? How is this meaningful? And I think when you're looking at public market issuers, so you're thinking about kind of listed securities, we have to look at what it is that data provider, the third-party data provider, is providing to you. They're providing 2 different things. One, they're providing a headline rating, which is kind of their own overall assessment of the sustainability of the issue or the asset that you're looking at. But then they're also, the second thing they're providing is all of the underlying KPIs, all of the underlying key pieces of information that drive that rating. Now, the gap between A and B is the rating has to do with their own special sauce. They've kind of, the product that they're selling is the IP that goes into how they build that rating. They might think I'm more interested in kind of circular economy and wastewater than I am interested in climate risk, and therefore I'm weighting the KPIs differently in how I aggregate that score. Someone else could be saying exactly the opposite. Both of the scores can be valid. They're different on purpose because that's the product that they're selling. They're selling their point of view. The underlying KPIs, so the key data points, are more consistent across different data providers. And so I think what we have to do as investors is dig below the surface of that, that key rating and understand what are the things that are driving that rating. And then from your point of view, based on your investment position, which of those matter? Which of those are important to the proposition you're trying to create through your investment? And so I think I tried to say that in a way that maybe can feel applicable to real estate as well as kind of like a broader market portfolio. But I think what we try to do is to take the best of information from a range of different data providers, identify the KPIs that we think are most material. When we're thinking about materiality, we're often thinking about the SASB framework, which has sector-based materiality. We have a version of that we've created internally that has our own weighting on different KPIs for different sectors. But what are the pieces of that third-party data that are material? And we collect it from multiple points, not just one. We create our own kind of rating on top of all of that. That's easy to say, that's an active investor point of view. When you actually have an asset that's being out and being graded and that grade is public, then you're obviously concerned with how that aggregation methodology is happening and how that special sauce is bringing you to a score, and is that score kind of a favorable score or not. So GRESB is obviously a really important rating framework in real estate, and that's, if I were getting started and thinking about where I should value and what I should kind of orient my framework around, that would be the starting point. But I think in my own like in your own sausage making, in your own assessment of an investment, I would be thinking about the kind of the more underlying data points that can be generated from a lot of different sources and what you think is meaningful for what you're trying to create.
So I appreciate that because it's hard. Just again, sort of beginning to think about how large BlackRock is, of course, and I assume you are investing in sustainable industries and you're investing in things like sort of companies that are, whether it's alternative energy or
renewable power. Yeah.
Is there much conversation across sort of the company that, because I assume the real estate folks could really learn a lot and sort of be enhanced by some of the investments that are being made in some of these environmental spaces. And I'm thinking things like, there's a question in the chat about, modular construction and just, or is there sort of cross conversation across the company about what they're learning over here that could help real estate?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that we're organized at BlackRock actually is in a real assets group, which is exactly that, is real estate plus renewable power together. So those are not only kind of like very close colleagues, but they're led by the same kind of sustainability framework across the two of them. We have a global head of sustainable real assets whose job is to work with both of those two teams, and so the information is definitely shared. A lot of what my team does at BlackRock is not just working with each individual team to help them identify their own frameworks for ESG integration. One of the things that we did last year, I'm now doing like a parenthetical, one of the things we did last year was to actually document the ESG integration approach for every single of our active investment processes, all the way from cash to like real assets, and kind of make each PM document what they think is material, what phase of the investment process they're bringing that information in, and to what extent is it like this is a source of information, or this is actually like an alpha generation consideration, in my framework. So we've done this across all of our different portfolios, and for public market assets, it's actually on our product pages. But we also do a lot of work in terms of sharing information. And so, like, best practices is kind of a lame term, but generating and sharing and scaling best practices is like a massive opportunity, particularly if you're working in an environment the scale of BlackRock. And so what I've seen is, I talked a little bit earlier about one of our systematic investment teams. One of the ways that they approached kind of bringing both kind of like a, how do I invest into energy and invest into climate change at the same time consideration, the way that they built a portfolio happened to be the same way, like one of our multi-asset portfolios, it approached exactly the same thing. So even though their investment styles, the asset classes they're investing in are totally different, they actually use the same approach in how they thought about and executed the investment in both places. That kind of thing, I think, is pretty cool.
No, so I love that. You obviously are in Europe or in London. I guess that's part of Europe.
It used to be Europe. It was Europe when I came here.
Or I'm not sure what they call it now, but obviously the Europeans are far ahead of, and have been ahead of the globe as it relates to sustainability. I mean, do you see things over there today, as you think about the U.S., that we should be thinking about that are coming? I mean, what is everybody in Europe focusing on first and foremost as it relates to sustainability, and what does that mean for us, maybe?
Yeah, I would say kind of off the cuff, there are two things. One, regulation. Regulation. Europe has led the world in sustainable investment related regulation. And I think Europe has been very effective at trying to use different actors in the market, including asset managers and asset owners, as kind of like the point of leverage to push down frameworks for driving people more towards sustainability. I think that, until a year ago, it felt like the US was going in a different direction. But there's now a real kind of awakening of the opportunity or the consideration around regulation in the US as well. And the two markets are importantly different. Like the concept of fiduciary duty in Europe is different than the concept of fiduciary duty in the US. And so that's, it's never going to be exactly like a 1-for-1. But I do think that kind of the expectations around transparency, reporting, probably common taxonomy, like naming frameworks for, what do we call the things that we're doing, potential of some of these like kind of market-driven certifications. I think that there is going to be a lot closer look at those kinds of things as we go forward. I think the other thing that Europe is leading with that I will be interested to see if it scales is the idea of sustainable investing from an outcome perspective versus kind of a management of the asset perspective. So, when I think about ESG integration, what we're typically thinking about is how do we manage risk and drive alpha using ESG information in a portfolio? So basically, you're like, what are the impacts on sustainability things in the portfolio in the investment that I'm making? Impact is like, what is the impact of the portfolio out on the world? And net zero is the beginning of this, and net zero had a really big year in 2020. That's a silly way to say it, but the acceleration we saw towards net zero from like a government level, from a corporate level, from like an asset management level in 2020 was massive. And the question is, will that spill over to other areas of sustainability as well, where we're looking at not just kind of the impact of considerations on the investments, but the impact of investments on the world, and how is that regulated or monitored?
Love it. Well, so, and we're going to begin to wrap up here in a bit, but you spent a lot of time, obviously, with the, in the Obama administration, and we've got, President Biden and his administration in now that's gone to this whole government approach as their environmental strategy, because that's really what they can control. What's your view of what we're, likely to see out of the Biden administration, and is there hope that there can be progress made, especially on the sustainability side?
Yeah, I think I would be shocked if we didn't see progress. I understand from experience what a whole of government approach means, and that means that everybody sitting in their, in their respective agencies is thinking, what are the levers that I have to pull to drive this piece of the agenda forward? How can I make kind of parts of the story of the work that I'm doing consistent with this kind of the macro administration story? And so if you think about, I sat at the Treasury Department in my last couple of years, what are the things that the Treasury Department can control or consider in this space? Like, one, they're thinking about market risk considerations through nerdy alert, the FSOC at the Treasury Department. So they're thinking about, market risk considerations. They're thinking about tax policies. They're thinking about the convening power of the private sector. So the Treasury Secretary can say, hey, everybody, come in and come to a conference. And when you come to the conference, tell me the things that you're doing that you're going to be bringing to the table as well. If you replicate that across every federal agency, everybody pulling all of the levers, I think you're going to see both kind of like hard and soft pressure. So soft pressure being like there's really a culture change in the expectations of kind of like what is good, I think can really be evolved through that. I think the hard pressure is what can we do through regulation, through tax policy, through incentives. So there, through our spending policy, we can also have incentives about how we kind of nudge corporates in a different direction. And I would expect that through the Obama administration, we're going to be seeing kind of a blanketing of all of these kinds of considerations.
This is probably an overly granular concept, maybe real estate related, that might be outside of your sort of day-to-day thinking. But, in some respects, this whole of government concept should be even boiled down further to like the local governments. And from personal experience, the zoning ordinances and a lot of what drives the built environment is built and were developed in an entirely different, point in history that really don't apply. And frankly, a lot of the structure that is in place now is challenging to then do things that are environmentally sustainable. I mean, is there likely to be any religion that these, localities get at any point in time that we got to look at this entirely differently if we're serious about trying to encourage a different kind of development, if that is indeed what we're doing, or even redevelopment? So
I love this question. I'm going to say I'm answering this only as Meaghan Muldoon because I think this kind of stuff is actually really like fun and hard to think about. We live in a federal system. The U.S. is a federal system, right? So there's different powers that are allocated to different levels of government. But there are certain funding streams that come from the federal government that can have different considerations embedded in them that change what people do at the state and the local level as well. And so when we're thinking about this whole, the example of that is, highway funding and speed limits and seatbelt laws, for example. You know, everybody, all states have speed limits and seatbelt laws now, and that's because they want highway funding, which comes from the federal government. But there are ways that you can connect federal dollars to different kinds of actions that are happening at state or local levels. I would be very shocked if there aren't people right now that are thinking about how we can embed incentives the right way through the mechanisms that the federal government does have control of. There's also, again, that like, how do you create a culture of this? How do we kind of drive change through the market? Like, one of the questions that I often get when I'm talking in different settings is, you know, when is regulation? When are we going to have regulated ESG disclosure? And is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? So at what point will companies be required to put, you know, ESG disclosures in their regular financial statements? I think that could be something that could come, but I also think we've almost got to the point in the market where it doesn't matter, because if it doesn't become regulated, issuers in the market will start excluding themselves from opportunities for investment by not providing that kind of information. And that's because there's been such a cultural shift and an expectation shift in the market, number one, on like what is financially material, and number two, on like stakeholder expectations. And I think what you could see is, you know, as this whole government approach is kind of taking hold, you also have that market change where people are saying like, the expectations are changing. And so local governments are going to start to change in response to that as well.
I love that, and that's an interesting concept I'd not thought about, of tying some of that federal funding to change at the local level.
Again, only Meaghan Muldoon.
I get it.
Not President Biden.
I get it. Well, look, we're you know, kind of at the end of our time here. We like to, you know, keep these, you know, relatively short and dense. But you know, Meaghan, you've been crazy successful, and I'm sitting here so impressed by your ability to speak fluently on very granular real estate topics, and you've got to have an ability to talk about a variety of different, you know, financial assets out there. So it's really impressive how facile you are across those. You know, what's your advice to the students that are on the line here? I mean, as they, you know, today is the last day of classes.
Amazing.
For our students. You know, we've got graduation. Thank God we're doing it in person this year at Nats Park, which is a step in the right direction. It's not Healy Lawn. Everybody deserves to walk across Healy Lawn on a sunny day. It's my favorite day of the year. But can what would you be, you know, as you sort of, you know, look into the future and how important obviously all this is going to be, you know, regardless of if they're in real estate or, you know, investment banking of some sort, or, you know, whatever it might be, marketing, you know, what advice would you have, you know, for them?
Absolutely. And this is the kind of question that I love so much. I have to be really careful not to do like 5 different pieces of advice. I'll try to narrow myself to 1 or 2. I think one is I had a mentor once who kind of chastised me. He was like, at some point, Meaghan, you have to buy a farm. And what he meant by that was, you know, particularly if you look at the government phase of my career, all of my like jazzy jobs were kind of like senior advisor to or counselor to, which means you're basically attached to another really important person helping to give policy advice to that guy. Buying a farm is actually being the person responsible for knowing something, being the expert, and like having responsibility to executing that and driving it forward. I would argue, like, early in my career, I bought a farm. I worked on Social Security policy, and that was kind of I spent 6 years doing that before I got to those jazzy, flashy, you know, kind of like more interesting Obama era careers. But then the second farm I bought was sustainable investing. And the reason why it's important to buy a farm is it helps you, number one, it gives you a depth of content in something. And if you have a depth of content in something, then people know you can have a depth of content in something. And then they're more likely to give you the ability to try a range of different things. So don't be afraid to get deep in something, even if that something isn't necessarily the thing that you know, you like in all of your heart, you want to spend the next 50 years of your career on. Get deep in something, because the exercise of that gives you the ability to do other things. And then from that, I would take away, like, know what your transferable skills are. I went from Obama administration to BlackRock basically to test that proposition to see, like, can I do it? And going to the table knowing what your strengths were, I think was something that was really important for my being able to be successful, and also humble with what I didn't know in that second phase.
Well,
I'll
I
stop
love
there.
it. And all of those are very, very Georgetown qualities, if I might say so. So we're extraordinarily proud of you, Meaghan. We're proud of everything you've accomplished and continue to accomplish. We would ask you to contemplate and keep the Steer Center in mind if there's roles we can play, because we're aligned in wanting to move this forward. But thank you so much for being here with
Love
us
that.
today. Jason, thank you for making this a reality for us and you making the introduction. And to the 100 or so people that were on the line, we very much appreciate it. Hopefully you found this useful. And have a great Friday and a great weekend, and be well, everybody. Take care.
Congratulations, everybody. Hoya Saxa.
Hoya Saxa.
Take care, all.